بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Today we will begin the discussion of what has been considered to be, by the majority of the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh, the fourth of the agreed upon sources of Islam. Before doing that, of course, I tried to make it a custom to offer just a brief overview of some of the things that we've covered so far, and also to speak about a little bit about the reasons for the development of this particular discipline. Although it's not mentioned in many of the books, you will find realistically that the discipline of Usul al-Fiqh, of the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, it begins with certain assumptions. One of the first assumptions is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create us without a wisdom, or without a number of wisdoms, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wasn't just involved with some matter of play. Secondly, the second assumption is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set for himself a particular pattern or mode of acting. In the Quran, he refers to that as his sunnah. Sunnatullahi allati qad khalat min qabl wa lan tajida li sunnatillahi tabdila. In a number of verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to mention his sunnah. And of course, often the sunnah is mentioned as a reference to his deliverance of punishment upon violators after giving them respite, but at other times it is a reference to other things. And so the scholars believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it such that he has a particular pattern with his interaction with the creation. That being the case, once the Prophet ﷺ had transitioned and went into the presence of the most sublime companion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we call it Al-Rafiq al-A'la, that the community were not completely clear over what would constitute orthodoxy, that there was a concern, of course, with preserving the religion, and we saw that concern underscored during the first 2 years after the Prophet's death, alayhi salatu wasalam, with civil strife, and then eventually the decision to gather the pages of the Quran because of fear that the knowledge of the Quran would be lost by losing the lives of the learned people who had memorized it and had studied it. And to see this continue throughout Islamic history during the second compilation or standardization of the text during the reign of Uthman ibn Affan, and later, of course, other things, the Arabic language, grammar, exegesis, books started to be written, and eventually there was a major campaign towards the end of the first century, which was started to actually gather the Prophet's hadith en masse, so orthodoxy had been a concern, and so for those particular sects that had risen, had appeared during this particular time, and eventually were able to codify or to at least advance something in a uniform fashion, which articulated their particular views or their particular vision of orthodoxy. That we find that if we begin with the distinction between the Shi'a and the Sunnah right from the beginning, that the Sunnis had introduced the concept of ijma' or scholarly consensus, and we spoke about a couple of lessons ago. And this scholarly consensus was a particular principle, or we can say an idea or a source, some would refer to it as, which would constitute that particular principle which carried or bore the isma or the infallibility or the truly authentic interpretation of the religion from the Prophet to the community later. So the Prophet ﷺ was ma'soom. His understanding of the scripture was protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the question of who is it that will carry this, who will bear this orthodoxy, this idea of orthodoxy. And so the Sunnis came up with the concept of ijma', consensus, to say, well, it transfers from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the community. But as I say, when the scholars agree upon an issue, then that in itself is clearly accepted or believed to be an articulation of the divine will. The Shia, on the other hand, they say no, that the isma of the Prophet ﷺ, it transfers not to the community, it transfers to the prophetic household, and in particular through his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, and their progeny. Right. So we have the doctrine of the 12 Imams, among other things. When we look at the other subsects of the Shia, and so basically the early community were attempting to highlight or identify particular elements that they discovered or they thought about or they were able to discern or believe they had discerned, which represented things by which they could determine or understand God's pattern. Right. So when we speak about the rulings, the laws of Islam, that the scholars generally say, well, the laws are eternal. It's just that we don't know them. And so we develop a process so that we can disclose, the qiyas itself. Illegal analogy referred to as kashif li hukmillah. It is something that uncovers God's ruling. It doesn't establish a ruling, rather the ruling is already there. And so through legal analogy or through other sources, we come to know what that ruling is. Allah is the lawgiver, right? Not the jurist. The jurist is not the lawgiver, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see, and so the first two of the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, are really not of any major dispute. Now, all Muslim factions believe that the Quran is the absolute source of Islamic teachings, and the Sunnah as well is a source of the Islamic teachings. We may differ about what constitutes a valid Sunnah or not. That's one thing, but we still would agree that the Sunnah constitutes a valid source of the Islamic teachings. But then after that, we come to the issue of ijma'. As mentioned before, consensus is a point of dispute, point of disagreement between the scholars. The Sunnis, of course, accepted it. The Shia rejecting it. Then fourthly, we come to qiyas, legal analogy, and it's an important source because realistically, when we speak about the concept of ijtihaad, of scholarly endeavor, of legal extrapolation, that qiyas is the main tool that the scholar utilizes in order to determine whether or not a ruling which has been sort of highlighted in the original sources, the revealed sources, can be applicable to a new situation as well. And so this is why when you study Usul al-Fiqh, and in particular when you study the sources of Islam, both those that are undisputed and those that are disputed, that in qiyas, that there's a lot of detail involved. There's a very large chapter, and it is probably the most difficult of all the first four sources to really understand and to be able to master of all of them. And so that being said, it's still just like in the case of ijma', as you mentioned before, there's a point of dispute. The Shia not accepting it, the Sunnis, of course, deeming it to be a major source of the Islamic teachings. When we come to qiyas, we have a similar type of disagreement, that most of the Sunnis are in agreement that, yes, that this is a valid source of Islamic teachings, and in particular Islamic law, whereas the literalist school, the Zahiriyya, were totally against it. They said, no, that legal analogy has no place in any of this. The Hanbalis themselves, they accepted it in principle, but generally tried not to apply legal analogy because of their orientation of a sort of a traditionalist orientation. They would call Ahl Hadith, that orientation which attempts to avoid too much reasoning into revelation, that that not allowing the human mind to become the ultimate arbiter of what is truly good or evil. So they sort of they were dissuaded and dissuaded others from doing that. To the Zahiris were even more extreme than that. Say, that there's no qiyas even to begin with. Whereas it said that Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, on the other hand, he had a position that if before he applied legal analogy to a situation, that he would rather follow a weak hadith before he would apply legal analogy. Now, the Shi'a was similar to this. The Shi'a, in particular, the mainstream, the Jafaris, the Twelvers, are also opposed to illegal analogy. That they, like these Sunni schools, they were opposed to it, similar to them being opposed to legal analogy. To ijma, consensus. And that was largely due to the fact that, especially when we take into consideration the Twelver doctrine, which basically said that the infallibility of the Prophet or the divine protection of the Prophet transfers from him to his to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then to Al-Hasan and Hussein, and then all the way down to the 12th of those imams. That as long as the imam is alive, then no other opinion means anything, right? So qiyas means nothing. Ijtihaad means nothing, right? And no claims of ijma' mean nothing, because the one who has the divine protection is the imam, right? So this is fundamentally why they largely they rejected it, and there are certain forms of it they did accept. But before even getting into the text, it is important for us to understand a distinction between different types of analogy, or the word qiyas itself. And it means it doesn't always translate as legal analogy. So, for instance, qiyas is a term utilized in the discipline of mantiq, logic, in the Arabic language as well, but it doesn't translate as legal analogy and from logic, because this is not fundamentally the same sort of process. So we're talking about syllogisms. We're speaking about it. Really, qiyas in logic means reasoning. So if I'm saying that every man is immortal, and since Aristotle was a man, so Aristotle is immortal as well. So that in itself, sort of syllogisms and reasoning, and you can establish fallacies or not. That's really not what qiyas is in Usul al-Fiqh. Or there's what we call linguistic analogy, a qiyas al-lughawi, which is applicable to what we call the umum, or generalizations. The issue of a universal category that is inclusive of a number of particulars, right? So like I find a word, and then if I extend that word to apply to something which seems familiar to it, even though it didn't exist at the time that the ruling was associated with that word, right? Then we'll just say that that's a linguistic analogy. An example of that would be, like, for instance, we find in our tradition there are prohibitions against types of imagery, or formation of types of imagery, like painting and sculpture, different types of art. You see, making a statue of a living thing, sometimes even painting, or other types of art. And so then some people today will say, well, photography also falls in the same category, because it is a surah. This is a surah, that's a surah. This is an image, that is an image, right? And so that's one way that people as well, they say, well, because this is not a legal analogy, this is a linguistic analogy. So just the word itself it encompasses that. And this is a type of analogy that the Shi'a did accept, but they didn't call it qiyas, they call it, this is umum, or umum al-lafz. And also the Zahiris as well, they would call it that too. But then, but in addition to that, they accepted the concept what we call qiyas al-awla, which is fundamentally an example of, like, when, let's say, for instance, in the Quran, Allah says that you should not say uff to your parents. وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا uff. Don't say uff, which really is an expression which means that the don't offer the slightest sign of discontent and disapproval of your parents, regardless of how upset you get with them. But so in Arab, it's uff, that itself is, you're like sucking your teeth or something like that. But to say that is prohibited, does it mean that it's okay for you to hit your parents? Or because it doesn't say that don't hit your parents. It doesn't say don't kill your parents. It says just don't say uff, right? But we say, well, of course, qiyas al-awla, yes, by that judgment itself is even more fitting to be prohibited. And so it becomes also haram to hit or to harm your parents in any other form, on the basis of this particular verse. So they would say that that's not itself is not an analogy, a legal analogy. Rather, that is something implied from the expression itself. So you have some semantics that occur when we get into the different factions which are there. At any rate, qiyas is an extremely important dalil, or evidence, or proof, or source of the Islamic teaching, Islamic law. And so this particular process of trying to identify sources and then extract the rules of interpretation from those sources, this itself, the ultimate goal, I would say, was for one to try to discover, right? To discover, or I guess you would say to discern the divine mind, or the God's mind in some sense, to try to understand how God's, mind works, you see. So if we can discover how his mind works, then we can arrive at or reveal or disclose to ourselves what he would say or has to say about a given situation that he hasn't really spoken about in the Quran, or his Prophet ﷺ hasn't mentioned in the Sunnah. And so this sort of process of usul, of the sort of legal extrapolation, this is something which the Orthodox tradition was identified with. So as opposed to just sort of arbitrary rules or arbitrary interpretation, where we say, well, I think it means this, and there are no rules to it. So again, it begins with the assumption that God did not create us without he didn't create us aimlessly and without wisdom, which the Quran itself attests to. And then second of all, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a normative pattern of acting, a normative behavior with his creation. So in the first verse, Shaykh al-Amriti, he says, أما القياس فهو رد الفرع للأصل في حكم صحيح شرعي. As for analogy, it is the tracing back of the branch to the root in a sound Sharia judgment. لعلة جامعة في الحكم ويعتبر ثلاثة في الرسم. Due to a unifying cause in the judgment, and it is to be considered threefold by convention. Okay, let's try to, of course, make some sense out of that. So Imam al-Juwayni, he says that qiyas رد الفرع إلى الأصل لعلة تجمعهما في الحكم. So it's that it is to refer the secondary issue back to the primary issue due to a characteristic that unites the two of them upon the same judgment. And so that is to say that legal analogy has four integrals. The first is, we call it asl, and this is to say that particular ruling which has been actually mentioned in the revealed sources. So we know that khamar, wine, is haram because of the Quran. We call that the asl. The Quran stipulates that drinking wine is haram, right? So the first integral is the asl. As-surah al-maqis alayha, the thing upon which we build our analogy. The second thing or integral is called al-far', the branch, or is referred to, translated as the branch, and as I say, this particular new issue that has arisen that didn't exist during the time of revelation, and so now we want to see if there's something in the revealed sources with which we can analogize it, that can be attached the same judgment or ruling or a law to this particular issue that is found in something in the Quran or in the Sunnah, right? So say for instance, so many of the scholars say that khamar in the Quran, which we typically translate as wine, like many of the Hanafis, Abu Hanifa and others say that khamar linguistically is a reference to grape wine. But then there is something called nabith, which is date wine. So some of them would argue that, okay, what the Quran is fundamentally forbidding is grape wine. And so in order for us to attach the same ruling of prohibition to it, to date wine, we have to discover what is it that makes it haram. What is it that makes it haram, right? So date wine will take the second rule, the same ruling. So what does it say? So the first issue is that we found something stipulated or mentioned specifically in the Quran, which is grape wine, and then the far', the second integral. This is the ruling for which we're seeking a ruling, or seeking to equate with grape wine. And then we have what's called the hukum, the judgment itself, which is of prohibition, that this is haram to drink. And then the fourth integral is the illah, which typically translates as the ratio legis. That is to say, this is a rational description, right? It is the basis for determining something to be equated with something else. Now, when many types of analogy, when some people think of analogy, they think that, okay, well, this resembles this in its appearance, right? So it should take the same ruling of prohibition, right? Whereas in legal analogy, it's not as easy as just simply looking at, okay, this is a liquid and this is a fluid and this is a fluid, right? This is a solid, this is a solid, so it should take the same judgment. Rather, no, there's another element, there's something else which is built upon some type of maslahah, some type of interest or that Allah has, or benefit he's trying to bring to us, or a harm he's trying to ward off from us, right? So the scholars have deduced that the particular element in this case of the prohibition of wine is what is called in Arabic al-iskar, inebriation. It produces inebriation. It produces drunkenness. That in itself, and of course, if you're drunk, and it can affect your sanity, and if you're not sane, then of course a lot of other things can happen. You can harm yourself, you can harm others. So at any rate, iskar. So we look at grape wine, prohibited, haram, and we say that it's haram because, right, it produces drunkenness. It produces inebriation. We compare date wine to it. So nabidh, if people drink it, can they get drunk? Yes, they can get drunk. So if the reason that grape wine is haram, then date wine should also be haram because it produces a similar effect, right? Or an equal effect, or a more powerful effect, depending on what it is you're drinking, right? So this idea of illah or ratio legis is extremely important, because when we start talking about the prohibition of other types of elements, be they pills or be they plants, we're not going to say, well, marijuana is okay just simply because, it's a solid and wine is a liquid, right? So no, we look at the reason for a prohibition. The reason for a prohibition that it is something that affects the intellect, affects one's sense of awareness, right? And so that particular element is the basis for which scholars have said that things like marijuana and some other drugs, many other drugs, are deemed to be prohibited. And of course, we know that that certain marijuana can have certain medicinal effects, and that's when we get into matters of exception. So we're not doing that. So those four integrals: the asl, the far', the hukum, and the illah. So the source, the branch, the ruling, and the ratio legis. So the source ruling, the branch ruling, the ruling itself, and the ratio legis. So this is fundamentally what those first two sets of verses really were talking about. But then he goes and said that there are three issues, and it is considered to be threefold by convention. He said, لِعِلَّةٍ أَضِفُ أَوْ دَلَالَةٍ أَوْ شَبَهًا ثُمَّ اعْتَبَرْ أَحْوَالًا. So either for a cause that is added on, or for a textual indication, or a similitude, then consider its conditions. Of course, I was confused. What the heck does that mean, right? So basically, what he's saying is that qiyas, and he's taken from Imam Juwayni's book. Imam Juwayni mentioned three types of legal analogy. One he calls qiyas wa illah. So we can say that this is a legal analogy of shared ratio legis, like the example mentioned just a minute ago about grape wine and date wine. So they share a rationale, right? A rational justification for the prohibition. So qiyas wa illah, and this is fundamentally what we're more concerned with. Then he says another is called qiyas dalala, which is we can say that this is analogy of implied similarity. Like, so this is to say that, like, for example, Hanafis and Shafi'is, they disagree over, and also Malikis as well, along with the Shafi'is on this issue, over what is the basis for zakat being due on the wealth of a young person, right? So a young person who hasn't reached puberty, person's not, not an adult, right? Why does one have to pay zakat? Is it because, or let's say why does one not have to pay zakat? Is it because of youth, right? Or is it because of something else? So the Hanafis will say, okay, well, the reason that the child does not have to pay zakat on his or her wealth, which he may have inherited, right, from their parents, is because they're young. The Shafi'is will say, no, zakat is due on it, even though they're young, because, it's because of the fact that it is wealth, and it has reached a nisab, a zakatable threshold. So even though they're not responsible, their caretakers are responsible for making sure that zakat is paid on their wealth. So basically, the point of this idea of implied qiyas, of implied agreement, that is to say that something looks like something else, that it should be that one ruling is something is used as a basis for an analogy, but it's not a point of agreement realistically, because scholars were not able to discern exactly what was the true ratio legis, what was the true rationale behind it. And then the third is al-qiyas al-shabah, and this is like for lack of a better expression, this an analogy of resemblance. That is to say, it's like if I say that that water should be unlawful to drink because it's a liquid, just like a fluid, just like wine is, right? So you understand, or that wine should be lawful to drink because it is a liquid fluid, just like water is, or like milk is. So it should be lawful to drink. You see, so qiyas al-shabah. So there's three sort of examples. So he highlights them to kind of like say, well, people make mistakes and they utilize this type of analogy and this type of analogy, but that's not really what's important. What's important is the first, that of shared rationale, the analogy of shared rationale. And this is fundamentally what we're talking about. And then he says, أولها ما كان فيه العلة موجبة للحكم مستقلة. The first of it is that where the cause independently produces a judgment. Right, so qiyas al-illa, the analogy of shared rationale, that is the one that produces the hukm that we're looking for. That is the one that fundamentally we're concerned with. فَضَرْبُهُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ مُمْتَنِعْ كَقَوْلِ أُفٍ وَهْوَ لِلْإِذَا مُنِعْ. So like a person beating or striking his parents is forbidden, like expressing irritation to one's parents, which is forbidden because of harm it causes. So that's to say that the illah, the reason why it's haram to say uff to your parents is because it causes harm to them. It's unlawful to harm your parents. So they say the reason, the rationale, the ratio legal illah is al-idha, that you can't bring harm to your parents. Right? And so if that's the case, then anything which would be considered to be harmful to one's parents, which is originates with the child, which also be harm for them as well. So I can't hit them, I can't, smack them, I can't push them, right? So fundamentally, that is what, just an example of that. وَالثَّانِي مَا لَمْ يُوجِبِ التَّعْلِيلُ حُكْمًا بِهِ لَكِنَّهُ دَلِيلُ. And the second, meaning the qiyas al-dalala, that of implied similarity, and the second is that where the citing of the cause does not produce a judgment, but it is a textual indication. That is to say that although we don't have definitive proof that this is the reason for the prohibition or the allowance of something, it still can be utilized as a proof by the scholars, because Imam Shafi'i said one thing, Abu Hanifa said another thing. So they're different about what is the actual basis of the of the prohibition or the allowance of something. And probably probably an example that is of interest of most people would be when we talk about matters of interest itself, riba. People sometimes translate as usury. That when you actually look into or study interest and you take it back to the prophetic era, that you find that there are 6 types of wealth which were deemed to be subject to interest. Which were the subject of the prohibition itself. So those are gold, silver, wheat, barley, dates, and salt. So these 6 things are the subject. So it's gold, silver, wheat, barley, dates, and salt. So these are mentioned specifically by the Prophet ﷺ in the Hadith. Now, scholars, most of them have said that, okay, well, interest is not only applicable to these specific 6 types of wealth. Right, it can be applicable to things, more things that resemble these types of wealth, but they have to resemble them as well again in their illah, right? But first we have to find out what is the illah, what is the rationale or the ratio legis of those particular types of wealth. Now the Zahiris, the literalist school, say no, interest only applies to those 6. Why? Because they don't accept qiyas anyway. Right? So I mean, a lot of people would love that particular opinion today, right? Because you don't have to worry about interest, because it's like, hey, well, the Prophet said those 6, he didn't say anything else. There's no analogy, so don't worry about it. Go out there and spend your money, buy, borrow, and don't worry about interest. You see, on the other hand, the mainstream schools, they took the view that these particular 6 types of wealth were just simply examples offered by the Prophet ﷺ. So for instance, when we look at the difference between Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, and Abu Hanifa in describing the reason that gold and silver, in particular currency, are deemed to be subject to interest, you find that Imam Shafi'i and Imam Malik are in agreement. They agree. They say the reason why gold and silver or currency itself are subject to interest is because they are aslul qiyam. They are the sort of the foundation for appraising the value of other things, right? So anything which is deemed to be the foundation for appraising the value of other things, then that would also be subject to interest. So for instance, if we say fiat wealth or paper money, or electronic money, we have that today as well, that that itself, is the basis for determining how much your shirt costs or your car or whatever. That is the medium of exchange, right? Then that also will be subject to interest. So I can't exchange $1 for $2, right? Or $5 for $10. I can't do it, right? According to that rationale, right? But with regard to Imam Abu Hanifa on this issue, he says that the reason that gold and silver are considered to be interest-based forms of wealth are that they are things that are customarily weighed. Al-wazn, he said, they're mawzoon. So anything which is typically weighed also would be subject to interest, right? So it's not because they're currency or determining the value of other things or their medium of exchange, it's because there are things that are weighed. So like you can as well. Same thing, I could do sulfur, I can do anything, type of precious metal or platinum or anything. I can't exchange them, according to disproportionate weight. So 5 grams of platinum has to be had traded for 5 pounds of platinum, right? According to Abu Hanifa, right? Now, but when it comes to the food items, so that's gold and silver, and then your food items are wheat, barley, salt, and dates. That we find that all 3 of the scholars differ on why those are subject to interest, right? So Imam Shafi'i says the reason that these particular types of wealth are subject to interest is because they're food items, period. That's it. So that would mean that I can't trade 1 apple for 2 apples, right? According to Imam Shafi'i, right? Or 1 orange for 3 oranges. I can't do it, right? Because I can't trade 1 pack of Oreo cookies for 2 packs of Oreo cookies. I can't do it because it's subject to interest according to Imam Shafi'i. But Imam Malik, he says that, well, the reason that those food items are subject to interest is because these they're from a muqtat mudakhar. They're things, they're staples. One, they're staples, and they're things that can be stored for a considerable amount of time. So those two elements, a staple item, and they can be stored, right, for a period of time. So, for instance, for Imam Malik, it's okay for me to trade one apple for 3 apples, right, because they're not from the muqtad muqdakhar, right? They don't fall in that category. They're not subject to interest. I can trade two Oreo cookies for 1 pack of Oreo cookies, according to Imam Malik, because they don't fall into the category of they're staples or in things that are typically stored. So both of the elements have to be there. Then when we come to Imam Abu Hanifa, he said, well, why did the Prophet mention these 4 types of wealth, and why they're subject to riba, interest? Is that they're measured. Period. So things that they're customarily measured, like wheat and barley, salt and dates, then you have to exchange them without disproportion. They have to be the same. They have to be equal amounts. So anything, and it applies to rice. It'll apply to corn. You understand? So that's, fundamentally what the difference would be between those. So here, so scholars are differing about the different rationale for the prohibition against interest in regarding those types of wealth, and that would be, we call qiyas al-dalala. So when he says that, and the second is that where the citing of the cause does not produce a judgment, but it is a textual indication. He's basically saying that yes, it can be a dalil, it can be a proof, except that we can't say for certainty what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have to say about it. فَيُسْتَدَلُّ بِالنَّظِيرِ الْمُعْتَبَرِ شَرْعًا عَلَى نَظِيرِهِ فَيُعْتَبَرُ. But it is a textual indication. So it's a proof may be drawn from a valid analogy resulting in the Sharia judgment to be followed. Right? So that's pretty straightforward, clear enough. كَقَوْلِنَا مَالُ الصَّبِيِّ تَلْزَمُ زَكَاتُهُ كَبَالِغٍ أَيْ لِلنُّمُو. So like our statement that the property of the boy necessitates the paying of the zakat on it, like that of the adult for the purpose of growth. And so basically it says, so again, they keep bringing up this disagreement between the Imam Shafi'i and Imam Abu Hanifa about whether or not zakat is due on the wealth of a child. One of them saying it's because it's wealth, and it's mal namin, which is wealth. Nama means to grow, so it's like there's a proper word for that in English, but it's wealth which is subject to growth. And for that reason, Shafi'i says, yes, you have to pay zakat on the child, zakat on the wealth of a child. Whereas Abu Hanifa said, no, the reason that you don't pay zakat on it until the person reaches puberty, and then it becomes that child's obligation to pay zakat on their own wealth. والثالث الفرع الذي تردد ما بين أصلين اعتبارا وجدا. And the third type of analogy is that the status of which is intermediate between 2 entities, right? فَلْيَلْتَحِقْ بِأَيِّ ذَيْنِ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ غَيْرِهِ فِي وَصْفِهِ الَّذِي يُرَى. Right? It is to be assimilated to the one from the 2 it more resembles in its visible characteristics. I'm going to comment on this in a second because these are all connected to one another. فَيُلْحَقَ الرَّقِيقُ فِي الْإِتْلَافِ بِالْمَالِ لَا بِالْحُرِّ فِي الْأَوْصَافِ. The slave is to be assimilated with property, not with a free person in respect to his characteristics in case of damage. And so basically, he's giving an example of this category of qiyas al-shabah, qiyas of sort of an analogy of resemblance, where the ruling that we apply to this new situation is based upon its resemblance to a ruling which has been highlighted in revealed law. Right? But one scholar may say that this it more resembles one particular issue, and another says it resembles something else. Or a single scholar may say it resembles this and it resembles that, but it resembles this more than resembles that. So it gives this example. Of course, now he's writing at a time when slavery is still very much universal in the world. So he gives this example of a slave. So it says, well, what do you do if someone kills a slave, right? Is the slave to be treated like a free person, thereby necessitating that they receive, or the owner receive, or the family receive in particular, the full blood money that is to be, or blood wealth, which is to be given to them. Because typically, you're talking a person was killed, free person, 100 camels, right? So, so should the family be paid, or should the owner of the slave be simply be recompensed, compensated for whatever loss that had it acquired, had accrued to him? So if you killed the slave, or if you sort of injured the slave in any way, chop off his hand, or you did something, paralyze a limb of the body, do you simply pay for, that particular injury, or is the slave treated like like an animal, like a form of livestock, right? And thereby you simply pay for the damage, right? Same thing you would do for livestock. Or should it be treated like a free person, in which case, you would give it the full sort of value that a free person would be given, you see. So again, this is how they sort of spoke about, even though human beings, they spoke about them in this particular fashion during that particular period, So he's just giving this as an example. So it may not be totally clear. Some scholars may incline towards, okay, the slave is a human being, right? So we treat him like the human being. Others may say, we treat him like we would treat one of our beasts of burden. وَالشَّرْطُ فِي الْقِيَاسِ كَوْنُ الْفَرْعِ مُنَاسِبًا لِأَصْلِهِ فِي الْجَمْعِ. And the condition and analogy is that the branch should have affinity to the principle when they are joined, right? So the secondary ruling, of course, it resembles the primary ruling in the actual same rationale, as opposed to being disparate. بأن يكون جامع الأمرين مناسبا للحكم دون مين. So, and the condition and analogy is that the branch should have affinity to the principle when they are joined through the quality that joins the two together, being appropriate for the judgment with no ambiguity. And so the quality itself has to be something, a reasonable thing. And so, for instance, I gave an example a couple of times. It's like, well, the reason that wine is haram is because it's a fluid. Okay, if that's the case, then water would be haram as well as milk and juice, and so that can't be the reason. Or I say that marijuana shouldn't be haram because it's not a fluid like wine is, right? So I can't analogize the two. Say, well, we're not basing the prohibition on the way it looks. We're basing the prohibition on the impact or the influence that it has on the human mind. So that's why. So it has to be what we call munasib, is appropriate, an appropriate description, as opposed to one that is inappropriate. وَكَوْنَ ذَاكَ الْأَصْلُ ثَابِتًا بِمَا يُوَافِقُ خَصْمَيْنِ فِي رَأْيِهِمَا. And the principle being firm in such a way that two adversaries should agree upon it. And that is to say that if this is a point of debate, between scholars, then of course one scholar can't utilize a principle that he or she doesn't believe in order to negate or invalidate the claim of another scholar. They're just making this point about analogy, because sometimes that occurs as well, whereas like one school will rule one way in one issue, and then differently in a different issue that clearly is similar to that, and then another school will be consistent in both cases. And so an example of that would be, let's say, like the Malikis, when it comes to the matter of wudu, that the Malikis are of the view that you would wipe your entire head in wudu, right? Based upon the verse in the Quran, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, right? And wipe your heads, as a B with your heads. Sometimes people confuse it that way. The B itself means, we call scholars ilsaq, that is for the entire head. Whereas for some other schools, is just part of your head is sufficient. You see, whereas in some other cases, the same word with the same preposition, they'll interpret it the same way the Malikis would, and the Malikis would be consistent in that particular regard. At any rate, I want to hold you too long on this issue, but وكون ذاك الأصل ثابتا بما يوافق خصمين في رأيهما وشرط كل علة أن تضطرد في كل معلولاتها التي ترد. And the condition of each case is that it's consistently present in all its effects that occur. That is to say that if this illah is deemed to be valid, then it has to apply in every particular case which resembles the particular case we're dealing with. لم ينتقد لفظا ولا معنى فلا قياس في ذات انتقاد مسجلا. Also, that it should not be invalid in word or in meaning, and there is no analogy whenever such deficiencies are recorded. I think that's, pretty straightforward. وَالْحُكْمُ مِنْ شُرُوطِهِ أَنْ يَتْبَعَ عِلَّتَهُ نَفْيًا وَإِثْبَاتٍ مَعَهُ. And a further condition is that the decree should conform to its cause with either negation or affirmation together. That is to say that the scholars, this is what they say. They say that every judgment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed has a ratio legis, right? Now, some of those things or those rationales are discernible, others are not. Like for instance, we can't discern why Allah said pray 4 rakats of dhuhr, or 3 for maghrib, right? Or we don't know why 100 lashes for zina, why 80 for defamation, right? We don't know, right? Why? What's the number all about? You see, so those are indiscernible. Right? So when something, the illah is indiscernible, when the rationale is indiscernible, it cannot be the subject of analogy. It cannot be the subject of analogy. You can't analogize something upon it. You see, so that's why you say, well, 4 because I don't know, it's Allah loves 4, so I'll add 4 more, so it's 4 plus 4, it's 8. I'll do 8 rakats for dhuhr. You can't just do that. It's some things they call them غير معقول معنى. So they're indiscernible rationale. And an example of this that comes up as a point of dispute between scholars of the madhahib is like in the issue of the hadith, if a dog licks a bowl, right, then you wash it 7 times and 1 time with dirt, right? We all know that. So the Hanafis and the Shafi'is were of the view that this hadith indicates that the dog's saliva is najasa, that is impure. It's a source of impurity. For that reason, they made an analogy on it and they extended it to pigs, right? So it applies also to pigs as well, So they lick you or they're wet and they rub up against you, it makes you impure and you have to wash or clean up. So if a pig as well licks from the bowl, you wash it 7 times and an 8th time with dirt. But the Malikis, on the other hand, they say, well, no, this is a judgment which is غَيْرُ مَعْقُولٍ مَعْنَى. It is of indiscernible ratio legis. And the Malikis, they say that, that no animal while living is considered to be najas. It's najas, it's filth. It's all animals, all living things are tahir, are pure, clean, right? Right, and so and that includes pigs and dogs, right? According to the Malikis. Now that itself doesn't mean it's okay to eat a pig or it's okay to own a dog without a rightful reason, but that is what they say. So they differ here. They say, well, no, this is a case of where we're not able to discern what is the rationale for the prohibition. We just surrender and do what the Prophet said, and that's it. We surrender, just like we surrender. We pray the way we're told to pray, right? We fast the way we were told to fast, So even if we don't fully understand why, right? And so this is the reference to. And then finally, فَهِيَ الَّتِي لَهُ حَقِيقٍ تَجْلِبُ وَهُوَ الَّذِي لَا هَكَذَاكَ يُجْلَبُ. And the cause is that which in reality determines the judgment, and the judgment is that which is determined by it. And of course, one thing I neglected to say was that what the scholars are saying is that, so in those cases where we are able to discern a rationale for prohibition or the allowance of something, then fundamentally, what it means is that when that rationale is lacking, the ruling is not applicable, right? The ruling is not applicable. You can't apply the ruling, So the ruling, yaduru ma illatihi, and it revolves along with its rationale. Wujudan wa adama. If it exists, the ruling will be applicable. If the illah is non-existent, then the ruling will not be applicable. All right, so with that, inshallah, we open up to any questions. As I mentioned, that qiyas is one of the most, difficult chapters with regard to the sources of Islamic law. And this is just a brief overview. There's a lot more to say about qiyas and the different forms of qiyas and the illah itself and the way that you determine what the illah is and which one are valid, whether valid descriptions, among other things. So if there are any questions, inshallah, we'll open up for them right now. Yes. Well, yeah. Well, again, if you're talking about food items, then yes, in both cases, both food items and with regard to currency, that for Abu Hanifa, that his position was a bit more inclusive, much more inclusive, because like weighed and measured, it's pretty much everything. You're right, right. Measure. I mean, the horses. I mean, horses. They don't put them on a scale or things like that. You understand? Or put them inside of a cup, and But I mean, they're an example of non-fungible types of wealth, or wealth which don't have equals. So one horse is not equal to another horse, or one sheep is not equal to another sheep because they have different weights, and so of course the meat itself, once you slaughter, you can weigh it once you slaughter it. Then you see, that's a different thing altogether. I mean, and that's a bit more involved question, because the Malikis, to start with, don't allow one to eat horses or mules or donkeys anyway. They consider that's a form of haram meat for the Malikis, but not for the other scholars. There's certain other scholars consider dogs to be unlawful. The Maliki says just disliked. It's not haram to eat dogs or to eat predatory animals. Just dislike to do so. So it's once it's informed with meat, of course, then if you're trading meat for meat, right, then for Imam Shafi'i and for Imam Abu Hanifa, then clearly that would be a issue of interest if they're disproportionate weights. So, but not necessarily for Imam Malik, because the issue of prohibition of interest doesn't apply to things that are not staples and storable, right? Staples and storables, both of those together. But both elements, both descriptions have to be on the actual item itself. It has to be a staple and a storable. If it's only a staple but not a storable, or is a storable but not a staple, then it doesn't apply. Interest doesn't apply to that in his case. Anwar. Well, the difference between qiyas illa and qiyas dalala is that with regard to qiyas illa, we're talking about a case where the analogy is based upon a shared rationale, right? Whereas qiyas dalala is not necessarily based upon that, but what it is a point of confusion. It's like something that looks like it might share a rationale, but after searching deeper, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's consistency in the first example. Qiyas illa, generally, is an accepted consistency between the primary ruling and the second ruling and the rationale they share, and that in itself can apply to other things that are similar to that. Whereas qiyas dalala, there's a bit less certainty about that. But even the first part, the qiyas illa as well, at times can be somewhat confusing, between scholars, because scholars could differ about that too. But basically, the idea is that this is to say that this looks like it should be in this category, at first glance, but then it turns out that it's much harder to discern the difference between the two. Like I said, really realistic, all you need to be concerned with right now is qiyas illa, right? The others, over time, it'll right. It takes a little bit more nuance there. It takes a little bit more time. But the first one, for our purposes, is like, well, qiyas illa realistically is this the qiyas dalala is like, well, definitely there's it's not clear, and there's scholars might differ about it. That they don't necessarily, this particular stated rationale may not produce the ruling that we are looking for. But scholars can still argue for it. They can still argue that this actually is the basis for that particular judgment. So an example may be, let's say, like in the area of wilaya, of like guardianship. Like if we said, okay, the reason that a woman needs a wali in marriage is because, well, say a young girl, a woman needs, let's say woman. Let's say a reason that a woman needs a guardian in marriage is because when she's a young girl, she requires a guardian for her wealth. Someone has to guard her wealth, if she's not of age to dispense of her wealth. So the Hanafis will say, okay, well, the reason for the guardian is because of sigar, because of young age, right? So because when she's young, she can't spend her own wealth without permission, So once she becomes an adult, she doesn't necessarily need the wali anymore. Whereas another scholar would say, well, no, it may seem to be an equal type of comparison, but one is in the area of marriage and one is the area of wealth, and so they'll say, well, no, the reason why, so other scholars argue that the reason why, she needs a guardian, some would say that, that it's because of bakara, for instance, that she may be a virgin, for instance. I mean, there are many different examples out there. I'll try to give you something you can read, and hopefully that'll help you to understand it a little bit better, inshallah. Because this, like I said, qiyasul dalala, I mean, we're focused on qiyas illa. That's the most important of these three particular categories. Yes, Brother Harun.
Question from online. Sister Lena asked, when is analogy considered argumentation?
Well, I mean, it's considered argumentation when people are debating about what is the actual basis of the judgment. Like in logic, qiyas is kind of a form of argumentation, even if it's prior to debate, because of course it begins with claims and then an attempt to prove those claims logically. But then there'll be people who challenge those claims, because if, for instance, you define your term incorrectly, or if you apply to it the wrong type of association, then there are going to be others going to say, well, no, I disagree with that claim. So, for instance, as I would say, well, all terrorists are Muslims, right? And Anwar is a Muslim, so he's a terrorist, right? So for instance, that's like in logical analogy, but we'll establish as a fallacy. We'll say, well, no, it's a fallacy. We'll argue that. That's when argumentation. That's when it turns to argumentation, right there. But it's a valid type of argumentation, because we're saying, well, for one, you have to define Muslim, define terrorist, and then the association itself. On what basis are you making those associations? You see, and so we can debunk or establish it as a fallacy, but that's a necessary type of argument as well, especially because it does violence to people, and so but in these deliberations, the scholars themselves were having very valid debates as well, over what particular things are the legitimate rationale for the rulings that they were arguing for. Yeah, definitely, it can be a slippery slope to say that whenever the ruling, the illah is non-existence, that the ruling is non-existence. Yeah. However, when you believe that the ahkam are built upon ilal, then it basically say that this judgment has a context, and so you can misapply a judgment, right? So it can also do the opposite too. It can lead to the other extreme as well. It's like, well, I say, well, this ruling is there, and I'm supposed to apply it in every single circumstance, regardless of the situation, right? I'm supposed to kill people, because I saw this. I'm supposed to, you understand? They can do the opposite as well. So that is probably a more significant risk than the other risk of actually people arguing that certain things should be no longer applicable, at least sort of like a liberal type of religious culture. So the hyper-conservative or the extremist religious culture is probably more dangerous, because usually you're talking about now people's lives and their well-being being threatened. So if a ruling has an illah, then it's like, oh, well, if the illah is not there, then the ruling doesn't apply. That's fundamentally what they're saying, you see. So generally, let's say, like when it comes to travel, like the traditional teachings were that, woman can't travel without a mahram. She can't travel without a family member, a male family member who's there to protect her, look after her, But many of the scholars, they say, well, the reason the illah is khawf al-fitna, khawf al-darar, is fear of some type of persecution or fear from harm that's going to come to her, But so in those cases where she doesn't have that harm, then okay, she can travel by herself. And so like, cause there's a hadith that mentions that a day would come when a woman would be able to travel from Medina to Sana'a, la takhafu illallah, without fearing anyone except for Allah, right? And so that in itself, they say, well, here, right there, the Prophet sort of gave us the illah, right? Or what is the illah for the prohibition against image making, right? So many of the ulama say it's because of mubahatullah fil khalq. It is because one is attempting to compete with God in creation, right? So for this reason, we find a hadith that where the Prophet saw Aisha radiallahu anha carving something, and they said, "What are you carving?" When she was a little girl, she said, "Well, it was I'm carving a horse's wings." Didn't you hear that? The Prophet Sulaiman, during his time, there were horses with wings, and the Prophet laughed and he just kept going. You see, because this little girl doesn't have that intention. You see, whereas other people, adults, they're like, "Oh, my masterpiece! I'm getting away all the imperfections that God put in you. I'm gonna make a statue of you. And so you're competing with law and creation. And so if that's the illah, the true illah, then what happens when we think of photography? Is that the same thing? You see. But so it could be that we got the illah wrong, right? Or there could be a compound, rationale. It could be that. It could be one thing. It could be something else, right? The impressions that it places on people's hearts. Of course, we have problems with imagery today because, some people's imagery are made out to be godlike, and others are made to be, into criminals, right? So imagery it can be harmful, right? As well. So it may not totally be that, but again, mubahatullah fil khalq, so I'm going to make you as a people, as a group, look like you're more than what God made you into, right? It's many that make you almost God-like, so it can be consistent illah. And these other people, right, you're saying people who control the imagery, that you're going to make these people less than what Allah made them like, you see. So yeah, it can be a slippery slope, but I think is in the extremist version actually is more considerable, more worrisome than the opposite of that. Anything else? Any sisters? No. It's kind of heavy, wasn't it? It's like, oh man, I'm here and stuff, scaring people away. All right, Hammer. Yeah. I think we probably have maybe one or two more. Well, yeah, well, the issue of who, that's one of the later chapters we're going to deal with, the issue of the qualifications of ijtihaad and taqlid. That's one of the later chapters. It's, now that definitely would be the argument, the Zahiri argument that, we have enough in the Quran and Sunnah that we don't need the analogy, right? Right. So yeah, you would be we'd just call you a Zahiri, like a neo-Zahiri. And, I know you're not saying, I'm just messing with you. So, well, no, because there's the section of the ways of determining the rationale. There's an actual bab, a chapter of that, Masalik al-Illah, and so of course the most reliable ways when it's from Nas, is based upon the text itself, but then some allow for ijma' can be the basis, but there's a dispute about that, and so beyond that, so if there's a dispute about ijma' being the basis of an illah, determining an illah, then of course anything less than the ijma', there's a lot of dispute, so about those type of claims. All right. Nothing else, Harun? Okay, well, alhamdulillah. You're scared of, huh? Inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Barakallah fikum. Inshallah. Barakallahu fikum wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. وسبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وسبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين. السلام عليكم.